bound and sold like livestock on a rough auction block. Tayen was about to change everything the cowboy who bought her believed. The moment he cut her ropes, he did not know he had just freed the daughter of the very chief his own outfit had wronged years before. What began as one guilty man's act of mercy became a debt written in blood, trust, and love, tested by a spurned rival, a suspicious town, and warriors riding down out of the mountains to collect what he owed. Josiah Cole thought he was only tearing up a piece of paper. He had no idea he was tearing open his own past. Watch till the end to see whether an old debt could ever be repaid with a wedding vow. And if this story moves you, like and subscribe before we begin. Silverton Plaza, New Mexico Territory, 1883. The auctioneer's voice cracked over the crowd like a whip, and Tayen stood on the raised wooden platform with her wrists bound in front of her, refusing to let her chin drop, no matter how the men below jeered, spat, and cried their bids like she was a mule at a livestock sale. Dust hung gold in the noon light. Flies droned over the water trough. Somewhere a dog barked at nothing, and the whole ugly business went on as if it were no different from selling grain or hides. She was Chehenna, one of the Warm Springs people, though not one soul in that plaza knew it, and she carried herself the way her mother had taught her to carry herself, even when the world tried to make her small, spine straight, eyes forward, breath even. Fear lived in her chest like a second heart, but she would not let it show on her face. Showing it would only feed them. She had been 3 weeks a captive by then, passed hand to hand from the scalp bounty men who had flushed her and a handful of others out of a canyon camp, to a trader who styled himself a labor broker, to this plaza and this platform and this crowd of strangers deciding her worth in dollars. The worst of it wasn't the rope or the heat or the hunger. The worst of it was not knowing whether her father was alive, whether any of her people had escaped the soldiers and the smoke, whether she was now entirely alone in a world that had already taken so much from her family once before. Silverton itself was not a large town, but it liked to think of itself as an important one, a supply crossroads for 3 cattle outfits and a half-dozen mining claims scattered through the foothills, with a general store, a church, a jail that mostly held drunks, and a saloon and freight yard that dominated the west end of the plaza, the way its owner liked to dominate most things he touched. Auctions of debt-bound labor were not common there, but they were not unheard of either, quietly tolerated by a circuit judge who rode through twice a year and asked few questions so long as the paperwork looked tidy, and openly encouraged by men like Rourke. Durable paperwork. At the edge of the crowd, a rancher named Josiah Cole reined his horse in and felt his stomach drop. He had ridden into Silverton that morning for nothing more than flour, nails, and a spool of wire. A plain errand on a plain day, the kind of errand that made up most of his quiet, solitary life. He had not expected to find a woman for sale in the middle of the plaza with a paper pinned to a post beside her reading, "Bill of sale, indentured labor, captive," in a clerk's careful hand, as though calling it labor made it anything other than what it plainly was. He had not expected the particular way she held her shoulders, or the particular color of the beadwork still knotted at her wrist despite everything that had been taken from her, or the cold certainty that dropped through him like a stone down a well the moment he looked at her face. He had seen that same stubborn, unbroken bearing once before, 5 years earlier, in the smoke above a burning rancheria in the Black Range, on a morning he had spent every year since trying to forget. Josiah Cole had ridden with the spur outfit back then, a green 19-year-old hand who did what his foreman ordered, because that was what young men did in that country, if they wanted to keep eating. The foreman had named it a reprisal raid. Stolen cattle, dead vaqueros, a debt that needed collecting, and by the time Josiah understood it was no such thing, that they had ridden down on a rancheria of families instead of raiders. The lodges were already burning, and men he had once counted as friends were doing things he would carry in his chest like a splinter of glass for the rest of his life. He remembered throwing himself between his foreman's rifle and a fleeing woman with a child on her back. He remembered the foreman's fist across his jaw for it, and being left afoot 3 miles from camp as punishment, and riding out from that outfit forever the next morning without collecting his last month's wages. He had convinced himself for 5 years that walking away had been enough. Looking at Tayen now, roped and auctioned in the noon sun, he understood for the first time that it had never been enough at all. The bidding had already climbed past what any honest man would pay for a plow horse when a heavy-set trader named Rourke stepped up near the platform and raised his hand again, grinning like a man closing a business deal he had been anticipating for weeks. Rourke ran the biggest saloon and freight yard in 3 counties and had a reputation for collecting things other men were ashamed to want, captive labor chief among them, dressed up in enough legal paper to keep the circuit judge from asking questions. He had his eye on Tayen the way a man eyes a prize horse he intends to break, and the crowd knew it, and nobody in that plaza was inclined to stop him. Josiah did not decide to stop him, so much as find himself already speaking before he had finished thinking it through. $50. The number came out of him steadier than he felt, and the whole plaza turned to look at the quiet rancher, nobody in town much bothered to talk to. Rourke's grin thinned. "This ain't your kind of purchase, Cole. Go on home." Josiah raised his own bid again, instead of answering, steadier this time, naming a figure high enough that Rourke would either have to match it or lose face in front of half the county. Rourke matched it. Josiah raised it further. Back and forth it went, the crowd murmuring, the auctioneer's eyes lighting up at the unexpected sport of it, until Josiah had gone further than sense allowed, and Rourke, unwilling to be outbid by a 2-bit rancher in front of his own regulars, finally shook his head and stepped back with a look that promised this wasn't finished. The auctioneer's gavel came down. Josiah Cole had just paid more money than he had earned in a season for a human being he had never spoken a single word to. He walked up onto that platform with his heart going hard against his ribs, aware of every eye in the plaza fixed on him, aware that whatever he did next would be talked about in Silverton for a very long time. Tayen watched him come with her, chin still lifted, bracing herself for whatever new cruelty this stranger's ownership would bring, her hand curling instinctively, though the ropes gave it nowhere to go. Josiah drew his belt knife. A gasp went up from the crowd, half of them certain they were about to see something worse than an auction. Instead, Josiah knelt, cut the ropes at her wrists with 2 clean strokes, and straightened up, holding the bill of sale the clerk had just handed him, the paper that made her, by the law of that plaza, his property, to do with as he pleased. He tore it in half. Then in half again, he let the pieces fall and scatter in the dust at her feet. "She belongs to nobody." His voice carried loud and plain, so Rourke and the auctioneer and every soul in that plaza heard it. Not to him. Not to me. Not to any man standing here today. The silence that followed had teeth in it. Somewhere behind him a woman grumbled about consorting with savages, and a man spat near his boots, and Rourke's face had gone the dark red of a man who has just been made a fool of in public and will not forget it. Josiah did not wait to hear the rest. He held out his hand to Tayen. Not a command, just an offer, palm up, and after a long moment in which she measured him the way she would measure a rattlesnake sunning on a rock, she stepped down off that platform on her own 2 feet, ignoring his hand entirely, and walked past him toward his waiting horse, as if the decision to trust him even that far had been entirely her own, which, in its way, it had been. Word travels fast in a small town, and by the time Josiah rode out of Silverton with Tayen walking a wary 6 feet behind his horse, rather than riding double with him, half the plaza already had an opinion on what they had witnessed, and not one opinion in 3 was kind. If Tayen and Josiah's story already has you hooked, consider becoming a channel member. Tap the join button beside the channel name to support more frontier love stories. She would not speak to him that first day, not one word, not even when he held out water from his canteen or slowed his horse to let her keep pace. She watched the country they crossed with the sharp cataloging eyes of someone memorizing every landmark in case she needed to run, and she watched him with the same care, waiting for the moment his kindness revealed itself as a longer con. Men who freed captives in front of a crowd, in her limited experience of white men, usually wanted something afterward that was worse than plain ownership. She had her knife, a small skinning blade she had managed to keep hidden in her boot through 3 weeks of captivity by sheer stubbornness, and she slept, with her hand on its handle, that first night in his barn, on a bed of clean hay he had made up for her without her asking, listening to the house for any sound of him coming. He never came. In the morning she found a plate of biscuits and salt pork left just inside the barn door, still warm, and no sign of him at all except boot tracks leading back toward the house and the ranch chores already half done in the gray early light. It was such a small thing, it should not have mattered as much as it did. Josiah Cole's ranch sat 2 miles outside Silverton, on land he had worked alone for 4 years. A modest spread of cattle and horses, and a house he had built himself board by board, the kind of solitary life a man builds when he does not much believe he deserves company. He had never married. Folks in town assumed it was because he was strange, standoffish, maybe touched in the head from whatever had happened to him out on the spur outfit's last cattle drive, the one nobody discussed directly, but everyone had heard some version of. The truth, though nobody had ever pressed him plainly enough to hear it, was that he did not believe a decent woman would want a man who had once ridden, however unwillingly, however much he had tried to stop it, with men who burned families out of their homes. He had built his solitude the way another man might build a fence, deliberately, plank by plank, to keep something in rather than to keep something out. Tayen's arrival did not so much break that fence as ignore it entirely. The way weather ignores a fence, simply passing through wherever it pleased. She kept to the barn the first several days, taking her meals alone, speaking only when speaking was unavoidable, and even then in short clipped sentences that gave away nothing. Josiah did not press her. He had learned enough on that platform to understand that pressing her would undo whatever fragile thing had let her walk off it beside him at all. He simply went about his work, mending fence, doctoring a lame horse, hauling water, and left her the room to decide, on her own time, whether the barn was a prison or a shelter. It was Rourke who forced the question of what the town thought of it all. 2 days after the auction, Josiah rode into Silverton for supplies and found the general store shelves suddenly, mysteriously bare of anything he needed, the storekeeper unwilling to meet his eyes, and a knot of men outside the saloon who went quiet and hostile the moment he passed. Rourke had been busy. He had spent 2 days telling anyone who would listen that Josiah Cole had made a public mockery of a legal transaction, that harboring an unbroken Apache woman on an isolated ranch was an invitation to renegades and raiders, that decent folk ought to think twice about doing business with a man who would rather side with savages than his own kind. It was ugly, effective talk, the kind that spreads faster than truth ever does, and within the week, Josiah found himself all but frozen out of the only town within 30 miles. He did not tell Tayen any of it. She found out anyway, the way people always find out the things kept from them, by noticing what was left unsaid and reading the rest in a man's tired shoulders when he rode in from town with an empty wagon bed. "They hate you now," she said one evening, the first full sentence she had given him unprompted since the auction. She was sitting on an overturned crate just outside the barn door, close enough to speak but still careful to keep several feet of open ground between them, the way she kept between herself and every man since her capture. "Because of me. They didn't much care for me before." It was mostly true, and it very nearly made her almost smile. "You should have left me on the block." She watched for the flicker of regret she half expected to find, testing him the way she tested everything. Now, no. He went back to mending the harness in his lap, offering nothing further. No speech about decency or duty, no demand that she thank him for it. It was, she would later admit to herself, the single word that did more to earn her trust than anything he could have managed in a full hour of talking. It was another week before she came to eat at his table instead of taking her plate to the barn, and even then she sat with her back to the wall and the door in clear view, the habit of a woman who has learned, painfully, that rooms can turn into traps. Josiah noticed and let it pass without comment, simply rearranging his own chair. So he sat across from her rather than between her and the door, and something in her chest loosened by a fraction she did not examine too closely. They began, slowly, and without either of them quite deciding, to teaching each other words. She would point at an object, the coffee pot, the lamp, the dog, dozing by the hearth, and give him its name in her own tongue, and he would repeat it back badly enough to make her laugh, a short, surprised sound. She seemed almost embarrassed by the first time it happened. In return, he taught her the English words for the ranch work she had started helping with. Once the barn no longer felt like a cage. Halter, fence post, brand, roundup, practical words, useful words, the vocabulary of a life she was, without either of them naming it aloud, beginning to build in that place. She turned out to be better with horses than he was, gentling a nervous colt he had nearly given up on with nothing but patience, and a low, steady voice he could not understand, but felt the calm in anyway. He found himself watching her work the colt from across the corral longer than any task required, telling himself he was only making sure the horse behaved. Autumn brought roundup, and with it a reason for the two of them to ride the whole spread together, cutting strays out of the brush and pushing the herd toward the lower pasture before the first hard frost. It was slow, dusty, companionable work, and somewhere in the middle of it Tayen pulled her horse up short, held a hand out flat behind her, and pointed to a coiled shape, sunning itself directly in the path where Josiah's boot would have landed in another 2 steps. He froze at her signal before he had even seen the snake himself, trusting her instinct before he trusted his own eyes, and when the rattler finally uncoiled and slid off into the rocks without striking, he found himself laughing from pure relief in a way he had not laughed in longer than he could remember. "You saved my leg," he said, still grinning, swinging back up onto his horse. "You saved my life on a wooden platform in front of half a county." She said it plainly, without drama, the way she said most things now that she had decided he could be trusted with the truth of her. "We are even for one snake, barely." That same week, she taught him in turn how to read the ground, the way her people read it, the difference between a deer trail and a cattle trail, the particular disturbed grass that meant riders had passed within the day rather than the week. The small telltale signs a man raised to look only at fences and brands had never once thought to notice on land he had ridden for 4 years. He found himself a better rancher for it within a month, catching a strayed heifer half a day faster than he ever would have alone, and he told her so plainly one evening over a supper she had cooked from a rabbit she had snared herself, using a method she had learned as a girl and taught him now with visible quiet pride. It became, after that day, an easier kind of quiet between them. Not the careful, watchful silence of 2 strangers waiting to see who would strike first, but the comfortable silence of 2 people who no longer needed to fill every space with talk to know the other one was still there. She stopped sleeping with the knife under her makeshift pillow sometime that same month, though neither of them named that change aloud either. Josiah only noticed one gray morning that the little skinning blade had migrated from beneath her blanket to a shelf by the door, kept close still, but no longer clutched. Silverton's Autumn Social, a barn dance held every year to mark the end of roundup season, put the town's true temper on plain display. Josiah had not planned to attend certain. The invitation had never truly been meant for him this season, but a rancher's wife who owed him a debt of her own quietly insisted, and Tayen, when he told her he meant to go along rather than expose her to the town's stares. simply looked at him with an expression that made plain she had not survived an auction block only to be left behind out of some misguided notion of protecting her feelings. She walked into that barn dance beside him with her chin exactly as level as it had been on the platform months before, and the room went quiet in stages. Table by table, the way bad weather rolls in, first the fiddle faltering, then the dancing slowing, and a knot of Rourke's regulars near the punch bowl. A man Josiah barely knew stepped into their path and asked, none too kindly, whether Cole's Apache had learned to dance yet, or only to run wild, and for one bad silent second, the whole barn waited to see whether it would come to blows. It was Tayen who answered, not Josiah, stepping forward, meeting the man's eyes without flinching, and asking in clear, deliberate English whether he intended to repeat that question to her face, or only behind Josiah's back, since she was standing right here, and perfectly capable of understanding every word he said. The man reddened, muttered something unintelligible, and retreated to the punch bowl to nurse his humiliation among friends who suddenly found somewhere else to look. The fiddle picked back up a moment later, ragged but game, and though half the barn kept its distance the rest of that evening, the rancher's wife, who had insisted Josiah come, pulled Tayen onto the dance floor for the next reel as though daring anyone else in the building to object. Nobody did. It was a small victory, the kind that does not undo a season of ugly talk in a single night, but it was real, and Josiah rode home afterward with something in his chest that felt, for the first time in 5 years, almost like belonging. If you've made it this far into their story, consider becoming a channel member. Tap join beside the channel name. It helps keep stories like this one coming every week. The wound she carried from the transport wagon that had hauled her to Silverton, a deep rope burn at her ankle. She had hidden through the whole ordeal rather than show weakness to men who would have used it against her, finally caught up with her a few weeks into her stay. When she favored that leg badly enough one morning that hiding it was no longer possible, Josiah knelt to look at it, and she went rigid as a fence post, every muscle braced for pain or worse. He worked with a gentleness that surprised them both, cleaning and binding the wound with the same careful hands he used on an injured horse, talking low the whole time about nothing in particular. The weather, the colt's progress, an old joke about a mule he had once owned, simply to give her somewhere to put her attention besides the fear. By the time he finished, she had stopped bracing. It was the first time she had allowed a man to touch her since her capture, without every nerve in her body screaming to run, and though neither of them named it directly, they both understood what it meant. A storm caught them a few weeks later, a real high-country gully washer that turned the yard to a river of mud and forced them both into the house, rather than let her ride it out in the barn, and they sat up half the night by the fire while the wind tried the shutters, and for the first time she talked, really talked, about home. She described the Warm Springs country back toward the Black Range where her people wintered, of her mother's hands working awl and sinew into beadwork by firelight, of the sunrise ceremony her cousin had undergone the summer before the world came apart, 4 days of songs and blessing that marked a girl's crossing into womanhood, a ceremony Tayen herself had never gotten to have, because by the time she was old enough, there had been no safe ground left to hold it on. She described her father, a chief the Tayen trusted with their lives, and of the terror of not knowing, 3 weeks now, whether he had survived whatever had scattered their camp and delivered her into a traitor's hands. Josiah listened to all of it with a knot tightening in his chest that had nothing to do with the storm, because the timeline she was describing, a burned camp in the Black Range, a family broken apart by raiders, matched, detail for terrible detail, the raid he had ridden on 5 years before and never once stopped grieving. Your mother, he made himself ask it, careful with every word, when he could manage anything at all. Did she survive it? The fire? Something closed in Tayen's face, an old grief she rarely let anyone near. No. She looked into the flames rather than at him. She went back into the lodge for my little brother's cradle board. The roof came down before she came out again. Josiah sat very still, because the woman he was picturing running back into a burning lodge for her child's cradle board, while a green 19-year-old rider screamed at his own foreman to stop, while the roof came down before anyone could reach her, was a memory he had never spoken to a living soul. A memory he had buried so deep he had nearly convinced himself he had only dreamed it. He did not tell her that night. He convinced himself he needed time to be certain, though the truth was closer to cowardice. He was afraid, plainly and simply, that the fragile trust growing between them would not survive the truth of who he had once ridden with, and he was not yet ready to lose the only warmth he had let into his life in 5 years of deliberate solitude. Emmett Rourke did not let his humiliation at the auction sit quietly, and he had resources. Josiah did not. Money, standing with the circuit judge and a network of men in 3 counties who owed him favors or feared his temper more than they feared their own conscience. He spent the better part of a month building a case, quiet and patient, that Josiah Cole's public destruction of a legal bill of sale had not freed anyone at all in the eyes of the law, only transferred the debt, and that the property in question, his phrase spoken with relish to anyone who would listen. What tipped his plan from petty spite into something far more dangerous was a detail one of his men noticed while watching the Cole ranch from a distant rise. The particular pattern of beadwork Tayen still wore knotted at her wrist. A pattern Rourke's old trading partner recognized from years dealing on the Warm Springs side of the mountains as the mark of a chief's household, worn only by Ananton's own blood. Rourke understood immediately that he was no longer looking at ordinary captive labor. He was looking at a chief's daughter, worth far more as leverage than she had ever been worth as a servant. He rode to the circuit judge with a new plan, dressed up as an old grievance, a warrant for Josiah's arrest on a trumped charge of theft and incitement, time to draw Josiah off his own land, and a second, quieter arrangement with a pair of scalp bounty men who had worked with him before. Men who understood exactly what a chief's daughter could fetch from either side of a war, ransom from her own people, or bounty money from an army eager to end one. Rourke told himself it was simply business, the way he told himself most of his ugliest schemes were simply business. It was, underneath the business, an act of pure vengeance, dressed in prophet's clothing, and he pursued it with the patient, ugly determination of a man who had never in his life accepted losing gracefully. The trap sprang on a night with no moon, riders coming quiet across the north pasture, while Josiah was 2 miles off in Silverton, answering a summons he had not known was false until the cell door was already locked behind him. Tayen was alone at the ranch when she heard the dogs go silent. All at once, the particular silence that meant men who knew what they were doing had already dealt with the dogs, and she was on her feet with her boot knife in hand and every candle blown out before the first rider reached the yard. She did not wait to be found. She had spent 3 weeks learning exactly what men like this wanted from a captive woman caught alone in the dark, and she had no intention of ever being that woman again. She slipped out the back of the house into the tree line, circled wide through the corral where the horses were already spooking at the smell of strangers, and put herself, deliberately, between the riders and the barn where Josiah kept his rifle and his powder, buying herself both distance and a weapon. Rather than running blind into open country, the way frightened prey was supposed to run, it nearly worked. She reached the rifle. She got off one shot that took a horse out from under Rourke's lead man and bought herself precious seconds, and for a wild, dark half-hour in the yard, she held 2 grown men at bay with grit and a borrowed Winchester and the same unbroken nerve that had kept her chin up on an auction block 3 weeks before. But there were 2 of them, and only one of her. And by the time Josiah, freed by a deputy who had finally checked the warrant and found it forged, riding for home at a dead gallop the moment he understood what Rourke had actually engineered, came tearing into the yard, one of the riders already had a hand locked around her wrist and a rope in the other. Josiah did not slow his horse. He came off it at a dead run with his revolver already drawn, and in the wild, close, ugly seconds that followed, a bullet meant for Tayen's back, fired by the second rider as she twisted free of the first man's grip, took Josiah high in the shoulder instead because he had thrown himself into its path. The same instinct that had once put him between a rifle and a fleeing mother 5 years before, finally this time aimed at protecting rather than only trying and failing. He went down hard. Tayen went down beside him. A half-second later, not fleeing, not frozen, but turning the rifle she had never let go of on the rider, closing in for a second shot and putting him on the ground before he could take it. The other two, seeing their advantage collapse and their employer's promised bounty bleeding out on the ranch yard dirt, broke and rode for the tree line rather than press a fight that had turned entirely against them. She'd knelt over Josiah in the sudden ringing silence, with her hands pressed hard against the wound in his shoulder, blood dark between her fingers in the starlight, and heard herself calling his name, his actual name, for the first time since the auction, not the cowboy or the man who bought me, but Josiah, with the same clean certainty she had felt watching him kneel to cut her ropes weeks before, that whatever this was between them had stopped being a wary truce a long time ago, without either of them quite marking the day it happened. He lived. It was a near thing for 2 fevered days, the bullet lodged close enough to the bone that the Silverton doctor, one of the few townsfolk who still dealt civilly with Josiah, worked half the night to bring it out clean. But he lived, and Tayen sat at his bedside through both of those days and both of those nights, her knife set aside on the nightstand for the first time since her captivity, because there was finally nothing in that room she needed protecting from. It was during the fever, in the low murmuring half-consciousness of infection and pain, that Josiah finally gave voice to the thing he had been carrying, silent for 5 years and 3 weeks. He recounted the Black Range, the spur outfit, a foreman's fist and a rifle he had thrown himself in front of, and a rancheria burning while he screamed at grown men to stop. He went on to describe a woman running back into a lodge for a child's cradle board and a roof coming down before she reached the door. He did not know, in the depths of that fever, that he was confessing it to the very daughter of the family he had failed to save. He only knew he could not carry it silent any longer. Not with her hand wrapped around his, not with the debt he owed her sitting so plainly, unbearably, in the room with them both. Tayen sat very still and listened to the whole of it, and by the time the fever broke 2 mornings later, she understood something she had not let herself understand, while he was simply the stranger who had cut her ropes, that the man bleeding in this bed and the raid that had killed her mother were the same story, the same terrible thread, pulled taut across 5 years and hundreds of miles until it had tied them impossibly together. She did not run. She thought, in the raw silence of that understanding, about running, some old instinct telling her that a man connected to her mother's death, however unwillingly, however much guilt he carried, could never truly be safe ground, but she found, turning it over through a long, sleepless night at his bedside, that the boy who had thrown himself between a rifle and a fleeing woman, and the man who had thrown himself between a bullet and her own back, 17 years later, were not opposites fighting for the same soul. They were the same soul, consistent across every year of it, a man who could not stand by while someone was hurt, even when standing by would have been so much easier and safer for himself. That, she decided, was worth more than the easy comfort of hating him for a raid he had tried, at 19, with everything he had to stop. When he woke clear-headed enough to remember what he had confessed in the fever, and clear-headed enough to be afraid of what it meant, she was sitting exactly where she had been sitting for 2 days, and she made it plain, before he could apologize or explain or beg forgiveness he half believed he did not deserve, that she already knew, and that she was still there. I should have told you before now. His voice was rough with disuse and shame. I was afraid you'd leave. I know. She had thought about it, and told him so plainly. I thought about it. She looked at the bandage on his shoulder, at the blood that had been hers to stop from spilling entirely away. You did not save my mother. You could not have. One boy, against his own outfit, that was never going to be enough. And some nights, I think you know that better than anyone alive. She met his eyes, steady, the way she had met the crowds on that auction block. But you have spent 5 years trying to be a different man than the one who rode that day. And when it mattered, when it was my life instead of a stranger's, you did not hesitate at all. That is not the same debt. That is a new one, and you have already begun paying it. It was not forgiveness exactly, not in the tidy, easy way the word is sometimes used. It was something closer to a decision, a choice, made with clear eyes and full knowledge to build something new on ground that had once been scorched, rather than let the old fire keep every good thing from ever growing there again. Word of a chief's daughter surviving captivity travels faster across Apache country than any telegraph line, carried hand to hand and fire to fire by scouts and traders in the kind of quiet networks that outlast any army sent to break them. And it was less than 2 weeks after the shooting in the ranch yard that Chief Clesta's warriors found the trail that led at last to Josiah Cole's land. They came at dawn, 40 riders across the North Ridge, where Rourke's hired guns had come only weeks before. And this time there was no ambiguity in the numbers, no possibility of a fight Josiah could win, even wounded and desperate. He stood in his own yard with his good arm useless at his side from the healing wound and understood, watching that line of warriors crest the ridge, that whatever came next would be decided by men who had every right in the world to hate him on sight, some of whom had almost certainly lost family in the very raid that haunted his sleep. Tayen walked out past him before he could say a word, out into the open yard alone, and cried up to the ridge in her own tongue, and the sound that came back to her, a chief's voice, breaking with a relief 5 years and 3 weeks in the making, was the sound of a father who had believed. Chief Clesta came down off that ridge at a hard gallop and swept off his horse before it had fully stopped, and the reunion that followed needed no translation for Josiah to understand, standing back at a careful, respectful distance with his hat in his hand, a father's arms around a daughter he had mourned. A grief 3 weeks old, cracking open into something that looked, from a distance, almost like joy. It was some while before Clesta's attention turned, inevitably, to the white rancher standing alone in his own yard, and when it did, the warmth in his face went hard and searching in a way that made Josiah's stomach drop the same way it had dropped on that auction platform weeks before. Tayen explained first quickly, urgently, before her father's men could draw any conclusion of their own. The auction, the torn bill of sale, the weeks of wary truce, the ambush, and the bullet Josiah had taken meant for her, the fever confession she had chosen, with full knowledge, to forgive. Clesta listened to all of it in a silence that gave away nothing. And then he pressed her further, in careful, accented English, clearly learned across years of hard dealings with settlers and soldiers alike, with a single question that mattered more than any other question in that yard. Which outfit rode the Black Range 5 winters past? His voice made plain this was the only question that mattered, and that the answer would decide everything that followed. Josiah did not lie. He had promised himself the moment he had confessed it to Tayen in his fever, that he would never again let silence do the work that honesty owed. He named the spur outfit, named the foreman who had led it, described as plainly as he could bear what he had done, and failed to do that day. The rifle he had thrown himself in front of, the fist that had struck him, the woman he had not been able to save. He did not ask for forgiveness. He made clear only that the debt was his to carry, regardless of whether the chief chose to accept anything he put forward toward it, and that if the price of Tayen's safety and her people's peace was his own life, he would not raise a hand against the men standing on that ridge to collect it. A long, terrible silence followed, long enough that Josiah heard his own pulse in his ears, long enough that somewhere behind Clesta a young warrior's hand drifted unconsciously toward the rifle across his saddle. It was Tayen who broke it, stepping between her father and the rancher without hesitation. The same fearless stillness she had worn on the auction block weeks before now turned toward the far harder work of asking her own people for mercy rather than demanding it from strangers. I have watched this man for a month. Her voice was pitched to carry to every warrior on that ridge, not only to her father. I watched him tear up the paper that made me his property in front of a crowd that hated him for it. I watched him take a bullet meant for my back without a heartbeat's pause to think of his own life first. I watched him confess unasked a sin he could have carried silent to his grave, because he would not let a lie stand between us, even when the truth might cost him everything he has left. He was a boy of 19 on the day our mother died, following orders he did not give and could not stop, and he has spent every year since paying for a debt that was never fully his alone to owe. She looked at her father, and her voice, for the only time in the whole ordeal, trembled at last. I do not ask you to forget what was done to us. I ask you to see the difference between the men who did it and the one man who tried to stop it and has spent his life since trying to be better than the worst day he ever lived through. Clesta studied his daughter for a long moment, and then studied Josiah with the same weighing patience, and whatever he found in that second look seemed to settle something in him that no amount of Josiah's own pleading could ever have reached. Blood debts, Clesta said at last, are not paid with more blood, not by a man who has already spent 5 years trying to pay it another way. He looked to the ridge, to the warriors waiting on his word, and something passed between them without a single word spoken aloud, the particular, hard-won wisdom of a leader who had buried enough of his own people to know exactly what more killing would and would not accomplish. There is a debt of land as well as blood. The spur outfit's range sits on water. That was ours before the soldiers came. If this man will stand with us on that account before the same judge who let a slaver auction my daughter like a horse, then I will call the blood debt closed between his house and mine. Josiah, standing in his own yard with his shoulders still bandaged and his voice not entirely steady, agreed that he would, and meant every word of it more than he had meant almost anything else in his life. It took 2 more weeks of careful, unglamorous work to make good on that promise. Depositions before the circuit judge about the forged warrant and Rourke's scheme. Testimony that unraveled Rourke's captive labor operation thread by thread until the same corrupt paperwork that had once auctioned Tayen like livestock, arrested for fraud, extortion, and attempted kidnapping, and a hard-fought agreement, brokered as much by Tayen's steady diplomacy as by Josiah's stubborn honesty, returning a stretch of contested water rights to Clesta's band that the spur outfit's raid had stolen 5 years before, under cover of a reprisal that had never been anything but land hunger, wearing a soldier's excuse. Rourke's men, leaderless and unpaid, once the truth came out in open court, scattered out of the territory within the month, and the town of Silverton, faced with the plain, undeniable fact of what Rourke had actually been running out of his freight yard for years, found it a good deal easier to forgive Josiah Cole for freeing a captive than it had ever found it easy to forgive him for embarrassing a man they now understood to be a criminal. Even the storekeeper who had once found his shelves too bare for Josiah's order came around eventually, in the slow, grudging way small towns come around to anything, by simply restocking the shelves 1 week and saying nothing at all about the weeks before it. One more thing before this story ends. Tapping the join button beside the channel name to become a channel member helps us keep telling stories worth watching all the way to the finish. The wedding, when it came, honored both of their worlds, rather than asking either of them to set the other aside. Clesta himself stood witness as his daughter and the rancher who had freed her exchanged vows, blessed in the old way by an elder of the Tayen band in a ceremony held at dawn on Josiah's own land that would, within the year, become shared ground between his cattle and her people's returning herds, grazing the recovered water rights together, rather than fighting over them the way their father's generation had. A handful of Silverton's more open-minded townsfolk came to watch, cautious at first and then, by the end of the day, genuinely glad, because there is very little in this world that changes a town's mind faster than watching two people build something true out of the wreckage of everything that was supposed to keep them apart. Tayen wore that morning the same beaded wristwork that had marked her as a chief's daughter to a greedy trader's practiced eye weeks before, and for the first time since her capture, it was not a secret she had to guard, but a truth she could wear openly, in a home where it was honored rather than priced. The rancher's wife, who had pulled her onto the dance floor months before, wept openly through the whole ceremony and later swore to anyone who would listen that she had known, from the very first reel, exactly how this story was going to end. Josiah stood beside his bride, with his shoulder healed to a scar he would carry, gladly now for the rest of his life, not as a mark of what had nearly been taken from him, but as a mark of the single moment he had finally, fully, stopped, only trying to atone for the man he had once been. By the following spring, the ranch looked like a different place entirely. Chihuahua horses grazed alongside Josiah's cattle on the recovered water rights without a fence between them, and it was not uncommon on a warm evening to see a handful of Clesta's riders sharing a fire in the yard with Josiah's own hired hands, trading stories in a mix of two languages and considerable gesturing, laughing at jokes that lost almost nothing in translation. Tayen finally received, that spring, the sunrise ceremony blessing she had been denied, as a girl a smaller version of it, adapted by the band's elders to honor a woman grown rather than a girl crossing into womanhood, but no less real for its lateness, held on ground that was, for the first time in her adult life, entirely safe. Josiah stood at the edge of it the whole 4 days, uninvited to the sacred parts of the rite, and understanding without needing to be told exactly why, but present anyway, the way a man stands present for the things that matter most to the person he loves even when he cannot fully enter them himself. Word of it traveled in time. The same quiet networks that had once carried news of a captured chief's daughter through Apache country, until it became, in its own modest way, a story people passed to each other on long winter nights. Not a story about a raid, or an auction, or a debt of blood, but a story about a torn piece of paper on a dusty plaza floor. And everything that grew, against every hard likelihood, in the ground it left behind. If Tayen and Josiah's story found its way into your heart tonight, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more Wild West love stories, and I will see you in the next one.